In this video, we're going to learn the basics of how to work with polygons in 3ds Max. Alright, so the first thing that we'll need to do is create a standard primitive in our scene to start working with. So let's go to the Create panel, Geometry, Standard Primitives, and let's use Box. I'm going to use the Cube Creation method, and then left-click and drag this into the middle of my scene, and then release, and then let's right-click to stop the creation process. Now with this box, let's go to the Modify panel, and you'll see that we have lots of different parameters. We have length, width, and height, and then we also have length, width, and height segments. And actually, that's not a lot. And in fact, this isn't anything that we can really do for this object to make it into a weapon or a character or an environment. It's just a box, and it will always just be a box until we convert it over to an editable object. So to do this, let's right-click and convert to Editable Poly. Now, I like to use Editable Poly because it gives me access to a lot of great tools that I can create anything that I can imagine. Now, with this box created, we are now using an Editable Poly object. We can now access the sub-object modes and begin modifying the shape of this into anything that we want. So let's talk about the sub-object modes first. So starting right here in the selection rollout, we have vertex, edge, border, polygon, and element. These sub-object modes, starting from the left side, will be the smallest edits that we can make to an object to the largest, which is far right. Let me show you what I mean by this. So let's go to vertex mode. You can click on it right here in the selection rollout, or you could hit 1 on the keyboard to activate that. You can hit 2 for edge, 3 for border, 4 for polygon, and 5 for element mode, and then hit 6 to enter object mode. Now, you could also hit 1 on the keyboard to go to vertex mode and then hit 1 again, and that will revert back to object mode as well. So either way will work. So let's go ahead and go to vertex mode. With vertex mode active, you'll see that we have these points where two edges meet. That is a vertex. So we can start moving this around using our move tool to modify the shape into something that we would like. Now, this is the smallest edit that we can make to an object, and we're going to be working with models, and we're going to be pushing and pulling vertices, getting the exact shape that we want. Now, if we wanted to, let's say, move things a little bit faster, we could go to edge mode. So instead of using just moving this vertex and then coming over and moving this one, or even just selecting both of them at the same time and moving them, we can go to edge mode. Now, if I select this edge and move it, it moves that vertex and the one that it's connected to at the same time. So an edge is a segment that is connected between at least two vertices. Now, we also have border mode. Now, border mode is not going to be as obvious. Let's talk about polygon mode first, and then we'll come back to border. With polygon mode, we have surfaces or faces on an object. These polygons are going to give us a really great way to create the actual shapes that we want. It gives us larger edits. So as you can see here with this polygon, if I have it selected and I move it around, it moves all 4 vertices and all 4 edges that make up that polygon. Now, we can also select multiple polygons at the same time by holding down Control. So, and you can do this with any sub-object mode. So don't feel that you have to just do one polygon at a time. So now that we've talked about the 3 major sub-object modes that you'll be using, so vertex, edge, and polygon, let's talk about border mode. Now, like I said, border mode is not as obvious as you might think. A border is essentially a set of edges or a loop of edges around an open polygon. So as you can see, this model has closed polygons all the way around. So what I would want to do is delete that polygon and then go to border mode, and then I can now select this entire loop or this border around that open polygon. Now, you might be wondering, okay, what's the point of doing that? When does it have its uses? Well, sometimes in our models, we can have open polygons like this, and all we want to do is really just extend them out. So I'm going to hold down Shift and extend that out. I could even use my scale tool, and I could hold Shift and scale it in to create kind of a rim there, and then hold Shift with my move tool, push that back. Now, the keyboard shortcuts that I'm using for move, rotate, and scale are W for move, E for rotate, and R for scale. So now that we have that, let's talk about element mode. Now, element mode is may appear to be very obvious, but it does have more uses than what we'll just see on the surface. So looking at this, if we go to element mode, you can select the entire object and select all of the polygons in that object. Now what we're actually selecting is the element itself. So one object could have multiple elements. Let me give you a good example of this. Let's go to the Create panel and let's go to Teapot, and left click and drag this in. A teapot is one object, so you can see that I can move it and it all moves together, but it has multiple elements. Let's go to Modify and let's convert it to Editable Poly and go to element mode, and you can see that I can select the teapot as an element, the cup or the pot itself as an element, the handle, and the lid. So one object made up of multiple elements. So what I could do is actually delete elements, and I can make this teapot into a mug. So either way is fine. Let's go ahead and delete that teapot out. And now what I want to do is I want to talk about polygon types, because we've started talking about elements and we've talked about polygons, but polygons are really, really important because they make up the surface of the geometry. So let's go ahead and go to our layer manager, and I'm going to turn off the default layer or hide that, and then unhide the polygon types layer that I've created. Now looking at this, you can see that we have 3 spheres, and these 3 spheres are made up of different polygon types. Now these polygon types are not created in any special way. They are just simply polygons that are formed into triangles, formed into quads, or formed into n-gons. So looking at this first one, we have the triangle sphere. Triangles are 3-sided polygons. Pretty simple. Every piece of geometry that you have, no matter if it appears to be made out of quads or even out of n-gons, every piece of geometry at its base level is made up of triangles. So whenever if we were to export out even this object to an FBX, we could have it triangulated and it would know how to make that into all triangles. So we would have these little triangles going through the middle of the quads. Let me show you what that would look like. If I were to right click and convert this over to an editable poly and go to edge mode and then turn on the turn tool, you'll see all of these invisible edges showing that even quads are made up of 2 triangles. Okay? So with this, let's talk about the uses of these different polygon types. Triangles are great. Okay, there's nothing wrong with them. There's only specific situations where you would want to refrain from using them. So triangles on an object that is animated could pose some issues. For one, it's not very clean. It can get very convoluted and it can get really messy. And if we were to put triangles around, let's say, the mouth of a character that has facial animation, a triangle could create some odd pinching or some very odd deformation, and it may not look quite right. So in areas that have a high amount of movement or animation, we would want to try to stick to quads as much as possible. Now you can have triangles, let's say that like right around the nose. Let's say there's a triangle in the nose somewhere. That area is not going to deform quite as much, and so a triangle might be okay. Now quads is going to be the thing that we strive for the most. Quads work out very well for smoothing as well as for deformation or animation. So this is the example that we would want to use for all of our models, and that's what we're going to strive for whenever we model throughout this process. Now n-gons is the last one. An n-gon is a polygon that can be 5 or more sides. It could be 5 sides, it could be 2,000 sides. It's still called an n-gon, or accepted as an n-gon. Now typically we don't want n-gons in our models because they can create unexpected results, especially if the model is going to be animated in any way. So if it's going to deform, it could create some odd deformation. It can also create some issues whenever we start smoothing, but it's not always the case. Sometimes n-gons like this smooth out okay. It's whenever we start getting n-gons that are like 10, 11 sides, or even higher, that can really cause some issues with smoothing. So with this, we try to stick from using n-gons, but I'll show you some different techniques on how we can convert these n-gons to quads or quads and triangles. And it just depends on the situation and the topology that we have. So now that we've talked about the different polygon types, let's talk about some geometry tips, some things that you're going to hear whenever you become a modeler. One thing that you're going to hear is polygon count. Polygon count is important. It's not nearly as important as it used to be, but it does have to be in the back of your mind as you're modeling. If you're on just an average machine, you could be modeling and get into the millions of polygons, and your computer begins to slow way down and it becomes very difficult to work. That does happen. So one way that you can keep an eye on your polygon count is by going up to Views, Viewport Configuration, and then your Statistics. You can enable them in the viewport by hitting Show Statistics in Active Viewport and then hit Apply, and you'll see that that shows up here. And then you can also adjust what statistics you actually want to see. So in my case, I want to see polygon count, and then as a game modeler, I like to turn on my vertex count as well. I like to be able to see that number because that's technically what matters inside of the game engine itself. Now you can also choose between the total polygons that are in the scene, or you could set it up to where it's just the selection, or you could do total and selection. So either one is fine. I like to just do total. So let's hit OK on that, and there's our statistics. Now you could also hit 7 on the keyboard to turn that off and turn it back on. So the next thing that we have is smoothing surfaces. Whenever we model out geometry, smooth surfaces are going to be part of the workflow. We want to create nice detailed meshes that are smoothed and crisp, and they look very professional. If you take a look at some of the objects, let's say just on your desk itself, take a look at them. Hardly any object that you have on your desk is very, very sharp or completely sharp. It has to be modeled in such a way. Even on the edges of your desk, you'll see that there's just a little bit of a curvature on that. It's smoothed out just a little bit. So something like this object here, on these curves, I would want to smooth those out in some way. This can be done very easily. Let's go ahead and convert it over to Editable Poly. And let's go to Edge Mode. And I'm going to select all of the edges on this. And I'm going to use a tool called Chamfer. And you'll see that it starts to smooth out those edges that I had selected. But let me add some segments in between. And you'll see that how it starts to curve that. So let me hit F4. See how smooth that's getting? And it looks very professional. So this could be used on something like, let's say, a dice for a D&D game or something like that. Smoothing out those edges will give it a professional look. So we always want to soften those in some way. Now we don't have to use that chamfer tool. We could use smoothing algorithms that are inside of 3ds Max right out of the gate. We could use something like OpenSubdiv. OpenSubdiv is a smoothing algorithm, and it will automatically smooth out an object for you. Now notice here, as we're using those n-gons and triangles, that topology gets really odd. So you can see here that this is a great example of how to try to convert an object over to quads instead of using n-gons and triangles. So now that we've talked about the basics of working with polygons and some of the situations that you're going to come about in 3ds Max and how it's going to help you to start thinking about your models in a different way and how to problem solve, let's talk about working with a different type of object inside of 3ds Max, and that's called splines.